Okay, so now we're going to divide rational expressions, and this will be part two. Have part four. This is part two. Part one was where we were looking at monomial factors, and then part two is where it's not necessarily going to all be monomial factors. So if you look at this example, so we're going to divide. We're going to divide these two rational expressions. So we have in the first numerator we have x minus 6 times x plus 4. In the denominator, I have 4x, and that rational expression is being divided by this rational expression, and that numerator is 2x minus 12, and the denominator is 8x squared. Okay, so just like you did before, the first thing I would do is change the division to multiplication. All right, change the division to multiplication. All right, so to do that, remember you're gonna change the division symbol here to multiplication, but then you're gonna take the reciprocal of the fraction that follows the division symbol. So the first fraction stays the same. So x minus 6 times x plus 4 divided by 4x times, and then this becomes 8x squared divided by 2x minus 12. And now the rest of this is the same. If I can find these, the rest of these are the same steps that you used in a previous lesson. Remember this one? So you're going to factor all polynomials, then reduce, divide out common factors, then write as a product of fraction, and then make sure you leave your answer in factored form. So step 2 then would be to factor all polynomials. All right, so factor all polynomials. So this is already factored. If you notice, it's a product of factors. This is a monomial, so leave it alone. This is a monomial, so leave that alone for right now. So this is the only one that it looks like I can factor because both of these terms have a 2 as a GCF. So this binomial, the GCF is 2. So I'm going to get x minus 6 times x plus 4 divided by 4x times 8x squared divided by 2 times x minus 6. All right, now let's go ahead and start talking about step 3 being to reduce or divide out common factors. Okay, so if you look at this right here, the first factor you see is an x minus 6. You notice that there's a factor that occurs at x minus 6 in the denominator. So now remember, if you're going to reduce, if you're going to simplify a factor in the numerator of the first fraction by a factor that's in the denominator of the second fraction, the symbol, remember, has to be multiplication. If it's division, you cannot do that. We talked about that in a previous lesson. Okay, so it is division. So let's go ahead and reduce this. So I'm going to reduce this like this. And so in this, remember, when you divide out, just like we talked about in the previous lesson, x minus 6 divided by x minus 6. So anything divided by itself is 1. Okay, so those divide out. So in its place, go ahead and put a 1 there. Then over here, notice that we have an 8 and a 4. So I can reduce those two. I can simplify those. So 4 goes into 4 one time. 4 goes into 8 2 times. All right, and then if you look at this 2 and the 2 again, those divide out. So this right here becomes a 1, and this becomes a 1 because 2 divided by 2 is 1. Now let's look at the x's. I have 2 factors of x here. I have 1 factor of x here. So this will divide out into one of these, and you're left with 1. So just remember your quotient rule from a previous course. When you divide like bases, subtract the exponents. 2 subtract this exponent of 1 is, say, 1. So you get x to the first. And that's all you can do. So the answer is going to be, now remember, all these are equivalent. So the answer is going to be 1 times x plus 4 times x. So you get x times x plus 4. Now go ahead and leave it like this. Leave it in factor form. Don't distribute. Just leave it as it is. So remember, one of the things we'd like is for you to leave your answer in factored form. All right. Well, that was step 4. I forgot step let's see. So let's write this step 4. Step 4, remember, would be to write as a product of fractions, right? As a product of fractions, of a fraction. Write the product as a fraction. Sorry. All right, so write the product as a fraction. So that's just right here. So write as a product of one fraction, that was one fraction, and then leave your answer in factored form. Okay, so I'm writing this as one fraction. That's what this is saying. So 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 is 1, but anything divided by 1 is itself, so you get x times x plus 4. So there's your answer. All right, let's look at the second one. All right, number 2, let's suppose we had 3x squared divided by x squared minus 1, and that rational expression is being divided by this one, x to the 5th divided by x plus 1 to the 5th. All right, I'm sorry, that's squared. So x plus 1 squared. Okay, so just like we did before, you're going to change the division multiplication. So I get 3x squared divided by, let's see, I get 3x squared divided by x squared minus 1 times, and then you take the reciprocal of the fraction following the division symbol. So you change the division multiplication, take the reciprocal of this fraction. So it'll be x plus 1 to the 2nd power divided by x to the 5th. Okay? All right, now let's go ahead. Next step is to factor. Remember, the next step is to factor all polynomials. Here, factor all polynomials. So the only one I can factor, if you notice, is just this one. So this is a monomial, this is a monomial, this is already in factored form. This is really x plus 1 times x plus 1. So I'm going to get 3x squared divided by, remember this is the difference of two squares, so I can factor it as x plus 1 times x minus 1. And here I'm just going to go ahead and rewrite this as x plus 1 times x plus 1 divided by x to the 5th. All right? Okay, now listen carefully. So we're going to look at each factor. My first factor I see is a 3. I cannot, if you notice, I cannot reduce this 3 with any factor down here because that's an x plus 1, that's an x minus 1, and that's x to the 5th. So the only way I could have done that is if I would have said I also have a factor of 3, a factor of 6, a factor of 9, a factor of 12, and so on. My next one is a factor of x. I have 2 of them here. So if you notice down here, I have 5 of them. So 2 of those will simplify with 5 of these. So I'm going to remove these 2 and put 1 in its place. And when I remove and when I simplify 2 factors of x here with 2 here, I'm left with 3 factors of x. So basically, if you want to visualize this is what you're seeing. Watch. So x times x over x times x times x times x times x. That's what you're seeing. And then these right here divide out, these divide out, and notice you have 1 times 1 is 1 over x times x times x, which is x to the 3rd power. And that's what you see here, 1 over x to the 3rd power. So if you do need to think of it like this, then think of it like that. Okay, my next factor is x plus 1 right here. And I do have a factor of x plus 1 in the denominator, so those divide out. My next factor is x plus 1. I don't have any other factors of x plus 1, so you're done. So all you have to do now is just rewrite step number 4, rewrite the product as one fraction. So I'm going to get 3 times x plus 1. So 3 times 1 times 1 times x plus 1. So that's 3 times x plus 1 divided by, and always put the monomial factor first. So x to the 3rd times x minus 1. Okay? So that's the answer there. All right, number 3, we have, let's suppose we had m squared minus n squared divided by m plus n, and that fraction is being divided by m divided by m squared plus mn. All right, so the numerator here I can factor, but and this one right here I can factor as well. But remember, the first thing you want to do is change this to division symbol. I'm sorry, multiplication symbol. So I'm going to say m squared minus n squared divided by m plus n times the reciprocal of this. So that's m squared plus mn divided by m. Okay, now go ahead and factor. So this right here is the difference of two squares. So I'm going to get m minus n, m plus n. Over here, I can't do anything with this, so that's going to stay m plus n times. Over here, the GCF here is an m, so I get m times m plus n. And then this monomial I can't do anything with. All right, now it's time to simplify. I have a factor of m minus n here. I don't have any down there. Have a factor of m plus n here. I have one right here, so I can divide those out. You have ones in their place. Have a factor of m here. I have one down there, so those divide out. Have a factor of m plus n here. I don't have any left, so then the answer is going to be m minus n times, don't forget the parentheses, times 1 times m plus n. All over 1 times 1 is 1, but rewrite this as just m minus n times m plus n. All right, so leave it in factored form. All right, number 4. Suppose we had x plus 2 divided by 7 minus x, divide by, and that rational expression is being divided by x squared minus 5x plus 6 divided by x squared minus 9x plus 14. All right, so change this to multiplication. So I'm going to get x plus 2 divided by 7 minus x times, and then the reciprocal of this, so that's x squared minus 9x plus 14 divided by x squared minus 5x plus 6. All right, so let's go ahead and factor. It looks like the only thing I can factor are these two here. So I'm going to leave these as it is. X plus 2 divided by 7 minus x times, and then here, let's say I get x, 7 and 2 is going to work, and both subtraction symbols. Down here, let's see, that's going to be x, 3 and 2, and both subtraction symbols. All right, now let's look at the factors. Okay, now remember our in a previous lesson we talked about the phrase opposites. Remember the phrase opposites, you're going to need it here. All right, so in other words, remember x minus 3 divided by 3 minus x. Those are opposites, remember. The opposite of x is negative x. The opposite of negative 3 is 3. And so remember what we did. Remember how we did this. We wrote one as a negative 1 and one as a positive 1, because remember, if you divide two opposites, two factors that are opposites of each other, like these, 8 and negative 8 are opposites, the quotient is a negative 1. The quotient's a negative 1. So in other words, 8 divided by 8 is 1. 8 divided into negative 8 is negative 1. 1 divided by negative 1 is negative 1. All right. So here, this x plus 2 is a factor. I don't have any x plus 2's down there. Here, x minus 7 is a factor. I don't see x minus 7 listed like that, but I do see its opposite. So remember what we did. We wrote one factor as positive 1 and the other factor as negative 1. I'm going to go ahead and write this one as a negative 1 and this one as a positive 1. Okay? One must be positive 1, the other must be negative 1. One must be positive 1, the other must be negative 1. Over here, x minus 2, I do see one down there, so those divide out. And then all I'm left with is this. Now, be careful how you write this. All these are equal to each other, all equivalent. So this is 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. And then that negative 1 is being multiplied by x plus 2. So in other words, you have this. Negative 1 times x plus 2 divided by 1 times this 1 is 1. 1 times x minus 3 is x minus 3. So that's one way of writing it. The other way of writing this is to pull that negative 1 out in front. So in other words, it will look like this. the opposite of x plus 2 divided by x minus 3. All right. Now, the other way, and there's nothing wrong with it, and I do remember one of our steps says that, let's see, step 5, leave the answer in factored form. But see how this is just right here, this is just a binomial. So if you distribute, there's nothing wrong with that. So you could have also written it as negative 1 times x is negative x, negative 1 times a positive 2 is a negative 2, divided by, make sure you extend this, divided by x minus 3. So all of those are correct for the way I've written this. Now there are other possible answers for this because you could have had a 1 up here and a negative 1 down there. Okay? The only way it would have changed, I'm just going to show you, because some of you may do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. So in other words, I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this portion over right here. I'll just write this as notice x plus 2 divided by 7 minus x times x minus 7 times x minus 2 divided by x minus 3 times x minus 2. So basically, remember how we had when we divided these out, we wrote this is negative 1, this is positive 1. What I'm going to do is write this as a 1 and this as a negative 1, and then these divide out. So really what you would have would be in the numerator x plus 2 times 1 times 1 is x plus 2. In the denominator, you would have negative 1 times 1 is negative 1 times x minus 3. So that would be an answer. You could have distributed if you wanted to, no big deal. X plus 2 divided by negative x, and then negative 1 times a negative 3 is a positive 3. All right. Or you could pull this negative, just like in the previous lesson. Go back and look at the video. In the previous lesson, you could pull out in front. So we would have negative x plus 2 divided by x minus 3. Okay. Now this one right here is exactly the same one as this one, but notice the different ways. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the different ways of writing the answer to this one. Now it's not 6 because this right here and this one are the same one. Okay, so let's look at 1 or 2 more. So let's suppose we had this one, x squared plus 7x plus 10 divided by x minus 1. And that fraction, oops, right here, this one. And that fraction has been divided by x squared plus 2x minus 15 divided by x minus 1. Okay, so first of all, change this to division. First thing you want to do, so keep this fraction as it is. So x squared plus 7x plus 10 divided by x minus 1 times, and then take the reciprocal of this one, x minus 1 divided by x squared plus 2x minus 15. All right. Then the next step is to factor your polynomials. So this I can factor, this I can factor. This is a binomial, GCF is 1. This is a linear binomial also, GCF is 1. In fact, you could automatically reduce these because it's the same one. But I'm going to wait to do that. Let's just go ahead and factor first. So the numerator here, that's going to be x plus 5 times x plus 2 over x minus 1 times x minus 1 over, and down here, that's going to be x plus 3, sorry, x minus 3 times x plus 5. Okay, so that's going to be the one down here. So x squared plus 2x minus 15 is this. And you can check yourself. Negative 3 times a positive 5 is a negative 15. The outer is 5x. The inner is a negative 3x. When I add them up, I get a positive 2x. All right, now let's go and start simplifying this. These x plus 5s divide out. You know, for one in their place. I have a factor of x plus 2. I don't have any down there. I have a factor of x minus 1. I have 1 right here. So I have 1s in their place. So the only thing that I have left then is 1 times x plus 2 times 1 is x plus 2 over 1 times x minus 3 times 1 is x minus 3. Okay? All right, and then one more. Let's look at this one. Number 6. Let's suppose we had, all right, let's suppose we had x squared minus 4 divided by 24x, and that fraction is being divided by 2 minus x divided by 6xy. Okay, so let's change this to multiplication. So I get x squared minus 4 divided by 24x times, and then the reciprocal of this fraction, 6xy divided by 2 minus x. All right, now also all I did was just change this multiplication into the reciprocal of this. Now the only thing I can factor is this one, so that's the difference of two squares, so I get x minus 2, remember all these are equivalent, times x plus 2 divided by 24x times 6xy divided by 2 minus x. Okay? Alright, so let's start looking at the factors. My first factor in the numerator is x minus 2. I don't see x minus 2 occurring as a factor in the denominator as x minus 2. But I do notice that these two are opposites of each other. So I'm going to write this as a negative 1 and this as a positive 1. Alright, so whenever you're looking at the quotient, two factors, and you're looking at the quotient and those two factors are opposites, you can get a negative 1 over 1 or 1 over negative 1. Does not matter. My next factor is x plus 2. I have an x plus 2. 2 plus x, remember, is the same thing as x plus 2. Oh, I'm sorry, that's 24x. Excuse me. That looks like x plus 2. All right, so that's 24x. So x plus 2, I don't have an x plus 2 in the denominator. Now my next factor I see is a 6. I have a 24, so 6 and 24 will divide, will simplify. So 6 goes into 6 one time, 6 goes into 24 4 times. My next factor is an x. I have an x right here. So those divide out. So I have this exact same number. My next factor is a y. I don't have a y occurring as a factor anywhere down there. So therefore my answer is going to be negative 1 times 1 times 1 is negative 1. And that's being multiplied by x plus 2 over 4 times 1 times 1 is 4, right here. Or if you want to, just like we did before, you could distribute the negative 1, no big deal. So negative 1 times x is negative x. Negative 1 times a positive 2 is a negative 2 over 4. Or if you wanted to, you could have pulled this negative out in front. So you could have said, well, that's going to be the opposite of x plus 4. I'm sorry, x plus 2 divided by 4. All right, so either one of those would be fine, and there are other ways of writing it. But if you want to write it as one fraction, just go ahead and leave it like that. And in fact, remember, we want to write as one fraction. Now, the other way you could have done it was make this the positive 1, this a negative 1, and then go from there. Okay. All right. So all of these are possible answers. Okay, so that should take care of this lesson.